Okay, so again, today we're going to look at, and we'll also be looking at some of this on Monday as well. Um, the struggle for civil rights, African American civil rights movement throughout the 1960s as it starts to make major advancements and launch massive protests throughout mostly the South. And then Monday we'll look at how the movement starts to shift after 1965 when it starts to move outside of the South and start tackling different issues that it tackles here in the early 1960s. Now, again, we've already seen, this has been brewing a long time. It's not like suddenly the civil rights movement just suddenly starts in the 1960s. We know that African Americans have been struggling for equality, and there have been movements to end racist practices, segregation, to improve economic opportunities and other kinds of opportunities for African Americans, since Reconstruction. We've seen since, in the 1920s even, or even before that, the formation of groups like the NAACP, which is heavily involved throughout the civil rights movement to enhance the rights of African Americans. We've seen movements for African American pride even in the 1920s with the Harlem Renaissance and some African American nationalist movements like Marcus Garvey. We didn't talk about that one in class, but hopefully you've read about it. And then most recently, we of course have looked at some instances in which segregation, legal segregation, which let's just go over a couple of terms here. We mentioned the court case back in the 1890s that it upheld segregation. What was that court case again? Plessy versus Ferguson. And what was kind of the name, the sort of, I don't really know the way to put it, name for the whole segregation system in the South? That's the doctrine, yes. What is I almost want to say nickname, but that's not a good word for it. Jim Crow, very good. So the whole Jim Crow system is a reference, so make sure you know that if that's not something you already knew. That when people talk about Jim Crow, the Jim Crow system, Jim Crow laws, you were talking about that legally enforced system of segregation upheld by the Supreme Court, system of racial segregation that was prevalent, of course, in the South and had been ever since, the days of Reconstruction. Now, the last thing that we talked about in regard to all of this, of course, was the major court case, the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which what did the Supreme Court say about that separate but equal doctrine in Brown versus the Board of Education?
It was considered to be unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional. But did that mean that desegregation suddenly happened?
No.
Of course not. We know that Southern states resisted it, ignored it, refused to enforce it. And the thing is, although Brown versus the Board of Education specifically spoke to education and public school settings, by legal precedent, that would technically apply to other public settings as well. Movie theaters and restaurants and hotels and that kind of stuff. But once again, Southern states and states that practiced Jim Crow were not about to just suddenly start desegregating. So in this phase of the civil rights movement, starting with things like the Montgomery bus boycott that we talked about last time, we start to see this focus on ending segregation, getting the federal government to enforce the Brown decision, and taking action to make that a reality. The court has already ruled, and now it is an effort to actually get those changes translated into actual policy and to end those practices. The Montgomery bus boycott had successfully done that in regard to bus systems and in Montgomery. And where we left that inspired other movements, that inspired other people to tackle segregation in a similar way. It provided, unity and clarity and leadership and kind of a direction. And so from that momentum, we will start to see more and more demonstrations to the same effect. One of the next major movements we want to talk about that did some of those same kind of things, so many of you have heard of these, were the sit-in movements that started in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. And they started specifically at lunch counters, at a lunch counter right here, in a Woolworths department store. Woolworths aren't around anymore, but that was a very common, like a department store. Sort of like the Target or the Walmart, I guess, of today. So a common place for people to shop. And a lot of stores, like Woolworths, there was one of them, they oftentimes, any kind of department store, would have a lunch counter in it. And as you can imagine, those were for white people only throughout the South. African Americans were not allowed to be served, or maybe only served at certain tables. And so when this first got started, just 4 students, just these 4 college students that you see right here, decide that they are going to protest segregation and try to bring attention to this problem by going to these lunch counters and ordering food in violation of the law, in violation of the segregation laws, in violation of cultural norms. So when it starts, these 4 students go and sit at the counter and order coffee. And of course, what do you suppose the worker behind the counter does? Denies them service. No, can't serve you. And they just sit there. They just continue to sit there. They don't say anything else other than ordering, continuing to say, we'd like a cup of coffee, or we want to order a cup of coffee. They don't, say anything else. They don't get belligerent. They don't complain about anything. They just sit there. That first day for about 45 minutes before they finally leave, or the lunch counter is even closed, I think. The next day they come back, but this time they have even more students with them. And the next day, and the next day, and they continue to recruit more and more students to come and join in this movement where they're just going to sit there and just wait. And of course, what do you think starts to happen as they just sit there?
People start to show up.
People start to show up. What do you think people do to them? They are hollering at them. They're, getting in their face. They are, pouring things on them, pouring coffee, pouring the sugar, pouring milk, different things all over them. What do you think these people do? They just sit there. They just sit. That was a very important part of their strategy, was to not react at all. Because what was going to happen if they reacted, if they were to say something real confrontational, or, try to hit somebody or something?
They probably would have been sent to jail.
Yeah, they probably would have arrested, sent to jail, probably killed. They knew it was very, very important that they could not retaliate. And, it's an incredible amount of discipline that went into this whole thing. And eventually that starts inspiring more sit-in movements. So it started with this one lunch counter, this one Woolworths, and then other stores it starts to happen. In other cities it starts to happen over the next couple of weeks and months. Eventually it spreads over multiple states even. I'm thinking about 13 states total. You have sit-in movements like this one. Big crowds coming. And this becomes a real problem for the store managers and the store owners, because they've got these big crowds of people forming. It's not very good press for them when it starts to show up on national news. So eventually Woolworths even just shuts down their lunch counters to avoid this kind of bad press. But that really wasn't a good decision, economically, because that means they're not making any money off selling the lunches. That was really, damaging to their income, which of course these groups and these students realized. Eventually, it results, because they don't want the negative press, because they don't want any violence to break out, they don't want any more negative attention. This results in the city of Greensboro ending segregation practices. So they eventually succeed. And the point was, for these students, it wasn't just about ending segregation here and ending segregation there. That was a lot of it. But it is a lot also just about bringing attention, about making the rest of the country see, about showing the injustice and showing how unfair and unjust and how wrong it was that people that were African American couldn't even just be served a simple cup of coffee at a lunch counter the way that a white patron could. And so this is bringing further attention to the problem, and attention then to other areas of segregation. And it is also further, bringing or showing the success or the potential success of nonviolence, of civil disobedience, not retaliating, not being violent, but just bringing attention to these problems. And so more and more activists are starting to plan other kinds of similar movements. So in the next couple of weeks and months, not only do you have more sit-ins, but you have other kind of similar demonstrations at other kind of facilities, and training and recruiting of other activists, other volunteers, particularly a lot of young people, to try to participate and to initiate and escalate a lot more demonstrations. Not long after the success of the sit-in movement, which by the way up here at the top, that is the actual counter that they first sat down in. It's in the Smithsonian now. They took it out. Well, there's no Woolworths anymore anyway, but that's in the Smithsonian if you ever get a chance to go see it. But in the weeks following the Greensboro movement, there's the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or it's usually called SNCC, S-N-C-C. So if you just remember that, you'll remember what it is. So this was a group of, mostly obviously students, college students, young African American college students that wanted to engage in more protests. So a lot of civil rights protests are going to be organized, or at least, partially organized. They might cooperate with other groups by SNCC, by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Again, they were committed, at least at this point, to absolute nonviolence, no retaliation or anything like that. And they would have training, sessions with their activists where they would, literally practice, having people get in your face and say ugly things to you and using the N-word and all that kind of stuff so they could learn to keep their emotions in check and not fight back, because that was absolutely crucial to this whole thing. So we'll be seeing SNCC involved in lots of other demonstrations. And like I said, they were beginning to engage in demonstrations similar to this all over the place. They would have kneel-ins at all-white churches. They would have wade-ins at all-white swimming pools and other things like that, where they would use nonviolent civil disobedience to try to show the injustice, try to bring more attention, to try to force, they know that state officials are probably not going to do anything, but if they can get the attention of the federal government, get the attention of the president, of the courts, and force the, enforcement of things like the Brown rulings, that was kind of their overall goal. This inspires another big movement to attack specifically segregation and transportation. Some of you may have heard of the Freedom Rides of 1961, or the Freedom Riders, as the people that were involved in this protest were called. This was also organized partially by SNCC, as well as another group, I didn't list up here, called CORE, that mostly recruited Northern activists. A lot of the participants in the civil rights movement were a lot of Northern college students as well that had seen all this stuff on TV, heard about it, and wanted to be a part of these demonstrations and protests and to bring some kind of change. The Freedom Rides, this was meant to target the segregation on interstate bus systems, as well as segregation in general. But they organized these bus rides where volunteers would board buses, and their goal was to ride these buses through the South from Washington, D.C., all the way to New Orleans. And it's an integrated kind of protest. A lot of these were, so some of the volunteers and participants were African American, some of them were white, and they're going to ride through the South, bringing attention not just to the bus situation, interstate buses, Montgomery Bus Boycott, city buses. Here we're talking about like Greyhound buses and stuff that would have gone over multiple states. And also stopping in southern towns and just you can see their signs there trying to bring attention to this whole problem. Now, they probably realize that what's going to happen when they start rolling into some of these southern cities and towns? They're going to get yelled at. They're going to get harassed. And more than that, they're going to get beaten. They could possibly be killed. They definitely could get hurt. In fact, that happened in multiple stops where, as the riders came off the buses, there'd be mobs of people there, not just to shout at them and say mean things, maybe to throw rocks at them, beat people. There were plenty of people that were beaten, that were hurt, had heads busted in, black eyes, all kinds of things, and they would just sit there and take it. You also have this extreme example that you can see right here. What's happened to this bus? It's been bombed out. That happened right outside of Anniston, Alabama. And the riders were still on the bus. They were able to escape. But that was one more extreme examples of the violence that was occurring. The thing about the Freedom Rides, again, what they're trying to do is not just bring attention, to the public, but to get the attention of the government, to get the attention of President Kennedy. Up until this point, President Kennedy, like Eisenhower before him, he was supportive of civil rights in that he sympathized and he, proclaimed to believe that African Americans deserved to be treated fairly and that segregation was wrong. Yet he did not want to take action against it and did not think the federal government ought to intervene, mainly because it's too divisive and he doesn't want to lose Southern support. But the thing about things like the Freedom Rides, they're trying to force Kennedy's hand to where he's going to have to, or he's going to look really bad if he doesn't. And Kennedy's attorney general is his brother, Robert Kennedy. They were begging with the Freedom Riders to put a stop to all of this and to, quit doing it and not bring about all this negative attention and all this violence and stuff like that. But of course they refused. That ultimately resulted in Kennedy feeling like he had to act, and they eventually sent federal marshals to escort the Freedom Riders, to protect the Freedom Riders. So little by little, inch by inch, maybe kicking and screaming a little bit at first, Kennedy is beginning to take some action to enforce or at least protect civil rights demonstrators. So he has not officially come out yet like in favor of any kind of like federal law or anything, but trying to protect at least these particular demonstrators. And this does eventually result also in interstate buses being integrated. The Interstate Commerce Commission eventually enforces previous court rulings to integrate interstate buses. So it's successful for that reason as well. So Kennedy is beginning to, and his Attorney General Robert Kennedy beginning to show some support for the movement, at least in trying to protect those that were protesting. And it also, still is demonstrating, before we get to Ole Miss here, which demonstrates a similar thing, but the Freedom Riders, the fact that these young people were willing to do this, knowing that they were putting themselves at risk, knowing that they were going to be beaten, knowing that they could get killed. It really demonstrated not just that unity, but it demonstrates this resolve that younger people in particular were tired of waiting, and they would rather die. They would give their lives for this. That they would rather be beaten. They would rather be spat upon. They'd rather lose their life than have to continue to suffer the indignity of segregation. And so it really was a turning point in really kind of showing that this had moved far beyond just people, filing a court case or something, that people were prepared to endure, very difficult hardship, violence, threats, abuse, death, in order to see changes be made. We see the Kennedy administration have to get involved once again a little bit later with the integration of Ole Miss, which was, of course, the University of Mississippi. James Meredith was an African-American student, first African-American student to apply or to enroll, rather, at Ole Miss. According to Brown versus the Board of Education, he is to be admitted. What do you suppose the government of Mississippi says?
Nope.
Oh, we're not going to let you in. So we have again that conflict where the state officials and college officials are, refusing to allow the integration of Ole Miss. Kennedy, once again, not really wanting to get too much involved, but feeling as if ultimately law and order had to prevail, sort of like Eisenhower felt with the whole Little Rock situation. They send, again, federal marshals to enforce the law. They're kind of taking the line at this point that this is about enforcing the law. It's about upholding law and order. It's not so much about civil rights itself. It's just about enforcing the law and the court's ruling. So they send federal marshals to escort James Meredith into classes at Ole Miss to make sure that the school is in fact, or the college is in fact integrated. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over too well. And it went a lot worse than it did in Little Rock. Riots broke out at Ole Miss over the integration and the entrance of James Meredith. There were riots. There were people setting things on fire, throwing bricks. Even 2 people get killed in the riots at Ole Miss. Nevertheless, despite all of that, and Kennedy, because of the riots and the violence and the unrest that broke out there for a couple of days, Kennedy eventually sends troops to quell the violence, to stop the riots from taking place. So once again, the federal government had to get involved. In this case, they're still not saying it's so much about civil rights, but about protecting law and order and preventing unrest and quelling the violence. But of course, it ends up with Ole Miss being integrated. James Meredith is able to enter classes, so the federal government and civil rights has prevailed there as well. So now we want to look at the next couple events. We want to look at not only bring further attention to segregation and in segregation practices in some places, but we're going to start to see the Kennedy administration in particular start to become much more supportive of civil rights rather than just intervening as a means of establishing law and order and enforcing court decisions. A real turning point in that is going to be the Birmingham campaigns of 1963. Birmingham, Alabama had a, very large African American population, but a very well entrenched and very discriminatory, very racist system of segregation, of course. And this was also an area where, white opposition to integration, white opposition to this movement was very, very strong. And so that is really a big reason why Birmingham was sort of chosen as kind of being a target for these protests. Because ultimately, they need protesters, civil rights activists needed visibility. They needed stuff that was going to get on the news. They needed stuff that was going to become, a spectacle nationally, so that they could show this injustice. Don't think of it as we got to get attention. They do need attention, but not so much in a selfish kind of a way. But they've got to show how violent this system can be and how truly unfair it can be. So in the Birmingham campaigns of 1963, you see multiple demonstrations, marches, and different things to protest just the overall segregation in the city, whether that's segregation in restaurants, segregation in movie theaters, segregation in schools, all of it. And this is where, and I'm sure you've seen some of these iconic images like this one up here. How did the police and the local authorities react to these marches and these protests? Right, they reacted quite violently. They use fire hoses against people to get them to disperse, which, that's incredibly high water pressure and incredibly painful and can really hurt people. You probably have seen images of the police dogs, setting vicious police dogs on people. And a lot of these people were quite young, a lot of them your age. A lot of young people volunteered for these protests and these marches and stuff. We're actually going to watch a little video documentary about that on Monday that's really interesting. And all of this, of course, on the national news. Birmingham firefighters, Birmingham policemen putting vicious dogs and fire hoses on children, on kids as young as maybe 10 or 11. And that was something that, horrified the nation, and it horrified President Kennedy. And it is not long after, it's in the wake of the Birmingham campaign, that Kennedy, so that's why this ends up being a rather important, pivotal turning point moment, because this is when Kennedy really comes out in favor of some kind of a federal civil rights law to say this is wrong and the federal government must intervene to prevent this. The federal government must intervene not just to protect these protesters and protecting their First Amendment right to free speech and to speak out and all that kind of stuff, but we have to take some kind of action to end segregation. This has got to be done. So he is starting to change his tune about that, or at least become more public about it. And the whole country really starting to see this as a moral issue, not just a legal one. It's not just an issue of the legality. The Supreme Court said that this violates the Constitution. It's a question of the law. But it's a question of what's right. It's a question of injustice like this can't be allowed in America and so forth. Okay, so, and with that momentum in their favor, this will lead to probably one of the absolutely biggest civil rights demonstrations of the whole era, the March on Washington, just a few months. The Birmingham campaign was April, May of 1963, and we see, of course, the famous March on Washington in August of 1963. Now, you may remember way back, we talked about, I guess it wasn't that long ago, but we talked about World War II, and African Americans and the Double V campaign and all of that, and how Philip Randolph had threatened and was kind of planning a March on Washington then, back in the 1940s, and eventually kind of agreed not to do it. But this is that basically same concept, and he was there, and he was one of the organizers of it. But here, thousands, probably about 200,000 people plan and participate in this march on Washington, D.C. To show their support for civil rights legislation, because at that point in time, Congress was debating what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was stalling in Congress. Congress was struggling with it. Kennedy's come out in support of it, but Congress is, wheeling and dealing and not 100% in support of it. Certainly the largest civil rights demonstration, there's speeches, there's lots of different speakers, including, of course, Martin Luther King. to speak to the civil rights protesters. And this does eventually result in, a year later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Again, it stalls in Congress. Kennedy's come out in support of it, and then it kind of, loses some momentum because obviously Southern lawmakers were very opposed to this. So they're clearly standing against it. It is eventually passed, as we talked about yesterday, by President Johnson, not too long after Kennedy's death. Johnson, and it's ironic, perhaps a little bit, that it is in fact a Southern president that ends up getting Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Using partially Kennedy's memory, he kind of uses that as an argument as to why it needs to be done. This is something that Kennedy wanted, and we need to honor his memory and honor his legacy by passing this law. And we talked about it already yesterday, so you probably already have it in your notes, is what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did. And that banned what? Right, this banned segregation, basically. Banning discrimination based on race, based on nationality, based on gender. So basically the end of segregation by federal law with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The March on Washington, of course, is where Martin Luther King's most famous speech comes from. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech. You've probably read it. You've probably seen it and heard it. But I thought, why not hear it again? At least parts of it. Probably haven't heard it in a while. Oops. Let me get it to work right. Just keep pressing the buttons, it'll eventually work. There it is.
I have the pleasure to present.
Right.
The light of hope to midday break. 100 years later, Asia. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty, in the midst of a vast ocean of material property. This nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the word of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the south with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, My Country Tears of Thee. Sweet land of liberty of DRC, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's cry. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. If America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the pervasive slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spirit. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
All right. Okay. Now, with segregation kind of at least having the federal government, of course, it takes, a little time, and there's always, roadblocks to getting that enforced. But certainly a major turning point in the civil rights movement with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And at that point, the movement shifts toward more specifically voting rights. Because the Civil Rights Act of 1964, theoretically, should have addressed things like voting rights, but we know that there were all those practices in place that I mentioned that the other day that were further preventing African Americans from gaining the vote in southern states. What again were some of those practices? Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and also just deference. It was just the system, the culture, the norm. That African Americans didn't vote, and he didn't bother to try. He didn't bother to register, to attempt to register to vote. But what was likely to happen to you, besides the literacy test and all that stuff, if you attempted to? You'd get harassed, your family would be put at risk, you'd be a target for violence. So there's just this system of deference, and you keep your head down, and you don't agitate the system, and you don't make the white people mad throughout the South as well. And so now, activists of the civil rights movement start attacking specifically the right to vote. And one of the first big demonstrations regarding that was in Mississippi. In Mississippi, like a lot of southern states, there were hardly not a single African American voting in most Mississippi counties. And so activists organized a campaign which became called Mississippi Freedom Summer in the summer of 1964. And the purpose of Mississippi Freedom Summer, and this was mostly a lot of northern college students, activists, that volunteered to go into Mississippi that summer to try to register African Americans to vote. That was their plan. They were going to register African Americans to vote. They were going to go around to African American communities, mostly rural communities in Mississippi, and hold voter registration clinics where they would help people to get through the voting registration papers and all of that stuff, educate people on voting and getting registered to vote, and trying to talk to people and encourage people and empower people to get them registered to vote so they would be a voice that really couldn't be ignored. And in the process, they were, holding other kinds of community services and just trying to reach out to and, extend a hand to rural African American communities in Mississippi. So thousands of workers, thousands of volunteers, a lot of them white, not all of them, but a lot of them, Northern college students start pouring into Mississippi in the summer of 1964 to lead these voting registration drives and hold these voter clinics and all of this stuff. Now, how do you think Mississippians, particularly white Mississippians, regarded all of this? They don't like it. How do they see all these activists coming into their state? It's almost a threat. They see it as an invasion. They have this attitude of there's nothing wrong down here, and the only thing that's causing all this mess is all these, northern agitators, bunch of communists trying to come down here and stir up trouble and stir up, the population, which is totally fine. So they, of course, were met with violence. They were met with threats. Particularly, the worst example of that, the picture up here at the top, 3 of these activists, 2 of them, some of the Northerners, and one was a local resident in Mississippi, went missing early in the summer. And they were missing for, I think, something like 6 or 9 weeks before they were found, of course, dead, being murdered by Ku Klux Klan activists. So there was all kinds of threats and violence being made, and then the murder, actually, of these 3 activists also. So this brought even further attention to the voting rights situation. Again, the 3 missing activists brought national attention to it. And it did result in increased voter registration throughout Mississippi, but it certainly didn't solve the overall problem, and didn't solve the overall problem in lots of other areas as well. So it also brings attention back to political rights, brings attention back to the movement, kind of sending that message that, okay, we got Civil Rights Act of 1964, but this isn't over yet. We still have things that have to be addressed, and this is still a dangerous situation. This is still a violent situation, and, people are still dying down here because of this whole thing. Now, this also leads to, I'm going to show you this little video right here just for a second. It leads to later in the summer, because this is also an election year, and there was the formation of something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. A lot of these activists argued, because this was during presidential candidate nomination process, and they argued that the Democratic Party in Mississippi did not accurately represent Mississippians, because they don't let Black people vote in the primaries or go to the convention. So they formed this Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and argued that they were the legitimate voice of Mississippi. And then there was this whole thing there at Mississippi's Democratic Party convention about if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party ought to be allowed seats at the convention. And that's where this lady that we're about to look at here, named Fannie Lou Hamer, gave this very, what became a famous speech. I don't think she gets enough attention, which is why I want to show this to you. And in fact, you'll see this happen on the video, and they'll talk about it for a second. She was so charismatic, and what she was saying was so compelling and heartbreaking. This was on that the president, actually, Lyndon Johnson, had the networks take her off the television so that people wouldn't get riled up by what she was saying. So a lot of people didn't hear it the first time, but then they hear about it on the news later. Let's see what she had to say.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee. My name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Greenville, Mississippi. Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastman and Senator Spence. But the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated. Now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to speak with our telephones out of the hook, because she's spreading dead. Because we want to live as decent human beings in America.
We will return to this scene.
Yeah, cut her off.
City, but now we switch to the White House and NBC's Robert Borowski.
Lyndon Johnson cut off coverage of FFGP testimony by making a last-minute request for network airtime.
And then he goes on about how
He had an hour before.
it's like 9 months since the Kennedy assassination. That was his press conference to say that it's been 9 months since Kennedy died. Trying to get the attention off there. Even though Johnson, later comes out in favor of was always really in favor of civil rights, was worried about the fallout from that kind of the speech. But a very compelling line, if this is a democratic country, if this is a country that claims to believe in freedom and rights and all of these things, then why are we allowing this whole situation to happen? Of course, probably one of the most famous events in this portion of the civil rights movement to bring attention to the lack of voting rights in the South, of course, is the Selma to Montgomery March in March of 1965, where hundreds of activists met in Selma, Alabama, planning to march to Montgomery to bring attention to the lack of voting rights and all of the racist practices, the literacy tests, and just the outright hatred that was preventing African Americans from voting. So they organized this massive march, and as many of you know, to get to Montgomery from Selma, you have to go across the River, which goes across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And what happens when these marchers arrive at the Edmund Pettus Bridge? You may know? Don't have this right. For real? Huh? So when they get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the state troopers are there. Alabama state troopers that tell them to leave, tell them to disperse, but these marchers say, we're not going anywhere. So they continue to march. And then the state troopers start tear gas, clubs, beating people, and a whole mess breaks out there. Let's take a look. Since you haven't seen it, I didn't realize. Oh, I'll get back to that in a second. No. Or that's John Lewis right there, by the way.
Be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm paying attention to no longer assembly. You have to disperse your orders to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue. Troopers here advance toward the gate, see that they disperse.
So this whole demonstration, this attempt at the march to Montgomery, hold on. There we go. Okay, so this incident became known as Bloody Sunday. because of the reaction of the state troopers and the way that they turned on the crowd or to beating people. A lot of people got hurt, heads busted in, all of that, known as Bloody Sunday. But eventually the marches did continue. Eventually President Johnson sent troops to escort the marchers, so they were able to complete their march to Montgomery, where they were met by jeering crowds and all of that. But nevertheless, the Selma to Montgomery March did very much what the Birmingham campaigns had done, 2 years before, and that this brought so much national attention to it. And it really outraged a lot of people, and the people were just repulsed and disgusted by what they saw, including Johnson, who had already, come out in favor of civil rights and had supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then, after this, says we have to do something specifically to address voting rights. So Johnson takes the stance at this point that voting rights must become a priority of the federal government to enforce voting rights for African Americans in the South. So this leads to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we talked about yesterday. This, remember, as we discussed yesterday, what kind of things did this outlaw or get rid of? Outlawed literacy tests, couldn't use those anymore. The poll tax, and poll taxes will eventually be outlawed with a constitutional amendment. And it also provided, federal oversight of elections in the South. That Southern states or those that had a history of discriminating against people in voting, like Alabama, could have elections supervised by the federal government, or when there were going to make any changes to voting laws or voting procedures, the federal government would have to approve of it, all that sort of stuff. This last little quick thing, this is Johnson's very famous speech he made after the Selma situation, giving his support for voting legislation.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Okay, so we're going to stop there with that today, and we will look, because after voting rights are secured, then we see another big shift in the movement as it starts to move toward things other than political rights, and it starts to move out of the South as well.